Good evening and welcome virtually to the James Monroe Museum. My name is Scott Harris. I'm Executive Director of University Museums here at the University of Mary Washington. I'm joined by our Public Programs Coordinator, Lindsay Crawford, who keeps the Facebook engine running for us. Tonight, we are pleased to offer another in a series of programs and exhibits that commemorate the bicentennial of the presidency of James Monroe, which occurred from 1817 to 1825. We're grateful for the support of our programs that is provided by our sponsors. We'd like to acknowledge them now. Fredericksburg Savings Charitable Foundation, Paul and Jane Jones Charitable Trust, Mr. Walter J. Sheffield, and the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust. We thank these and other friends of the James Monroe Museum for their support. I also remind everyone that the James Monroe Museum and Gary Melcher's home and studio, our University of Mary Washington Museums, have both reopened to the public. We do have COVID-19 protocols in place, so we urge you to go to the websites of the respective museums so that you can get all the details about how to make your visits safe and, we hope, enjoyable. That's GaryMelchers.org and JamesMonroeMuseum.org. During his 50-year public service career, James Monroe was no stranger to media scrutiny, nor was he a stranger to media manipulation. He was frequently a subject of newspaper reporting and editorial comment, and himself, from time to time, generated copy to advance his political interests. Even the catchphrase associated with his presidency, the era of good feelings, was coined by a Boston newspaper, describing the reaction to his presidential tour of the northern states in 1817. Today's media world and the ways it intersects with presidential politics have evolved considerably from the days of the early republic, and tonight's program, From Typeset to Tweets, Presidential Politics in the Media, will examine that evolution. Now, we welcome your questions during the event, which will be collected by Lindsay as you type them into the chat box on the right, and then they will be presented to our panelists at the end and our moderator. So all questions will be taken at the end, but please, as they come to you, type them in and they will be collected by Lindsay. I'm pleased now to introduce tonight's moderator, who is himself a true friend of the James Monroe Museum, and he will then introduce our panelists. Edward Jones is a former editor of the Freelance Star newspaper here in Fredericksburg. He joined the paper as a high school intern in the 1960s. And during his journalism career, Ed served as president of the Virginia Press Association, the National Conference of Editorial Writers, and the Associated Press Managing Editors Association. He has served as a Pulitzer Prize juror, and in 2006 was inducted into the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. So Ed, very glad to have you back. Thank you for taking part yet again in one of the James Monroe Museum's public programs. And Mr. Moderator, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Scott. I really do appreciate being asked to be part of this program tonight. This topic, the presidents and the press, is something I've been interested in ever since that long night in November 1960. I remember as a 12-year-old staying up way too late to see whether Kennedy or Nixon was going to actually win that election. I think tonight's discussion is not only going to be rich, but it's going to be incredibly timely. In fact, I would be hard-pressed to come up with a topic that's more relevant in the fall of 2020 than presidential politics and the media. It resonates with us literally every day. So tonight, we're going to take a look at that often combative relationship, not just as it exists today in the fall of 2020, but also, as Scott was referring to, as it existed 200 years ago, in the fall of 1820, when the gentleman right behind me, James Monroe, was coasting to a second term. And we'll go even further back than that, to none other than George Washington himself, to address this question of how has the press-president relationship evolved over the past 2 centuries plus. From George Washington's private meltdowns about his treatment by the press, to Donald Trump's very public accusations of fake news. And even our favorite son, James Monroe, who presided over the era of good feelings, occasionally had to lick his wounds as well. So that's quite a journey we're proposing to take in a little more than 1 hour. But I can tell you we have the right companions to help us do that. So let me introduce you to them. Dr. Stephen Farnswoth is no stranger to this community. He is a professor of political science and international affairs, as well as the director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington. Dr. Farnsworth is a nationally recognized expert on matters pertaining to the media and recent presidential elections, about which he has written extensively. In fact, I believe the count of books is up to 7. My personal favorite is Presidential Communication and Character from 2018, which is a fascinating survey of the press and presidents over the past 25 years. Dr. Farnsworth was the 2017 recipient of the Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. Welcome, Dr. Farnsworth. It's nice to have you with us tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky is currently scholar in residence at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College in New York and senior fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, as well as a former historian with the White House Historical Association. Her new book, titled The Cabinet, tells the fascinating history of how George Washington set in place the idea for a cabinet of key advisors, an integral part of the executive branch that we take for granted today. But in her telling of the story, it also sheds light on how the birth of the cabinet became an interesting reflection of our nation's government being created in a time when there were no precedents. And so Dr. Chervinsky is an expert on presidential history and US government institutions. And I believe, if I'm correct on this, Dr. Chervinsky, you also have a dog by the name of John Quincy Adams. Is that correct?
John Quincy Dog Adams.
John Quincy Dog Adams. So,
yes. So you asked me where I fall on the Monroe Doctrine debate. My dog's name kind of gives it away.
Yeah. Well, excellent. You are focusing on founding fathers in all sorts of ways. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we will converse with our two panelists, and then it will be your turn, as Scott Harris indicated, as they will entertain and address your questions. So let's begin the evening right now. Dr. Chervinsky, we think of the relationship between this president, Donald Trump, and the press as being particularly contentious. But if we look back over the whole history of 45 presidencies, how exceptional is it?
It's a great question, and I think it's a really important one and a great one to start with. For sure, there have been very contentious relationships in the past between the press and the presidency. Washington, to start with, was very sensitive to criticism and really was annoyed when editors would include stories, true and false, in the newspaper that didn't reflect well on him. Of course, John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Act, so you can't get much more contentious than signing and then jailing newspaper editors for publishing sedition. I think the reason this administration perhaps feels a little bit different is because in the past, when presidents, perhaps with the exception of the Sedition Acts, when presidents have been frustrated by the press, usually they don't put the particular editors or journalists on blast. Those frustrations tend to stay a little bit more quiet because they consider it beneath the office of the presidency to be targeting certain individuals. Whereas this administration tends to air its displeasure on Twitter.
So it's in some ways more personal and more public in this day and time.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that it was personal in the past. There were particular editors that Washington would get very frustrated with because he felt like that was a personal attack and he knew who they were, and their press was often just down the street from his house. And I'm sure I will share this story in more detail, but they would often deliver copies of the newspaper to the president's house even after he had canceled his subscription. So that was a very personal animosity and one that he really got under his skin. but he would have never considered it appropriate to single out someone publicly because that was beneath the office of the presidency. So even if there was that individual antagonistic relationship, the president wasn't going to air it publicly.
But it was pretty rough, wasn't it, the criticism? I mean, we were talking about things like taking money from the government and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, and editors had no problem just making stuff up. So for example, one of the reasons that Washington would get really frustrated is because editors would say that he was going to be at a certain place in a certain time so that people would expect him there and then would get angry when Washington wouldn't show up. And he was very frustrated because he never said he was going to be there. He had never made those arrangements. And so the press was setting him up to disappoint the American people. And he felt like that was incredibly unfair. And they would also print political cartoons of him being guillotined. And so, I mean, this was not subtle stuff by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Dr. Farnsworth, the same question, particularly from the perspective of the past quarter century, but actually going back through all 45 presidencies. How exceptional do you think this time is?
Well, I think, first of all, I do need to give you a disclosure. I used to be a journalist for 10 years. I had a White House press pass back in the day before I went to graduate school. So I'm not only talking about the media from the perspective of someone who writes about it as a scholar, but somebody who actually worked as a reporter under previous presidents. And I think what's important to recognize is that the media have a vital function in our society, and that is holding politicians to account. Ultimately, you do not need, in a free democracy, a media that is owned by the state, that is controlled by the state, that is heavily influenced by the state. None of these things would lead to an effective, informed citizenry capable of choosing their leaders responsibly and with proper information. So at the outset, it's important to recognize that this was never going to be a happy marriage between reporters and presidents. It simply can't be so if we want to have a president rather than a monarch. That being said, I think that one of the realities that we see in the modern environment is the increasing use of media that varies from person to person. I mean, for people of a certain age, including some of us, the news was really what was in the New York Times and what was on the evening news, and the people in other media outlets were seeing that sort of information coming through the Associated Press and elsewhere. So there was a national narrative, if you will, about what was going on in the country, what the important issues were, and the basic facts surrounding those issues were also largely consistently provided across media outlets. Today, though, we're talking about these media silos where people can really burrow into MSNBC or really burrow into Fox News or otherwise use the internet to give themselves a news diet, if you will, that really confirms their existing prejudices. You put all of that together and you can see why presidents are not going to be happy, because even if there is the occasional supportive outlet out there, I mean, MSNBC wasn't too rough on President Obama, and Fox News is generous with President Trump. The reality is that there are plenty of other places where people can go and they could see something combative, something unpleasant. And so that's the reality. I think that, ultimately being president goes back to the sort of maxim of Harry Truman, the buck stops here. If you don't like the ugliness that is the nature of contentious politics, be it with the executive and legislative branch or the presidents and the media, well, then maybe you're not in the right job.
Well, there is as you point out, the mission of the media, the mission of the press is not to be a PR agency to showcase a particular president's accomplishments. It's to dig into the facts that will hopefully show the truth about what's going on, both pro and con. But in a recent book that came out by Harold Holzer from Hunter College, he looks at this whole span of presidents in the press, and he refers to it as an endless battle. Now, it's one thing to say, well, the missions don't really, they're sort of counter to each other. There's got to be some conflict there. But what do you think about endless battle? Has this been an endless battle from George Washington to Donald Trump?
I think that's fair. But I do think that there is the occasional ceasefire. It's not a a war every day across 4, 8, or even 12 years of a presidency. What you see instead is periods where the coverage is relatively positive, coverage being more critical at other times. If you think, for example, about George W. Bush, his approval rating went from 50% or so to 90% or so in just a few days after 9/11. Now, the media coverage likely went from very critical before 9/11 to very positive after 9/11. And that positive coverage for the president really lasted until things really went south after Iraq. In fact, in one of my books, I say that the real pivot in media coverage comes at the same day of the mission accomplished statement on that aircraft carrier. That's when people said, okay, war is over. The coverage can be more critical again. And so during war times, the coverage is quite positive generally, especially in the early going. It gets more critical as the war goes on. People think that things are going to be over more quickly than they are usually in wartime. And so there is a dynamic that is really basically contentious most of the time, but there are positive moments here and there. Another positive moment comes in the immediate election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, a president who is coming into office when the previous president had 25% approval. Obama comes in with about 65, 70% approval when he takes office. And again, the coverage is very, very positive. When America is scared, the media are not nearly as critical. And when Obama took office in 2009, you look at the context of those months in early 2009, you see sort of a precipice in terms of the economic crisis and the uncertainty about going forward. There was a pretty severe, painful recession that came about in the last years of the Bush presidency that Obama basically had to deal with at the end. And so, and then during his first months and years as president. So there's a period of time where it's positive, but it gets pretty negative pretty quickly. But, you know, how can we expect anything otherwise? I mean, the media are for-profit institutions. They don't answer to politicians. Most of them don't answer to political entities or oligarchs in this country. And as a result, they're going to give people what they want. And what people tend to like, particularly in a society that was built with a revolutionary mindset, that's what the founders were about, limiting centralized power, most of them, that reality is going to create a media environment that would be highly critical. And it's been highly critical ever since because that's what we're willing to watch. That's what we're willing to pay for. And that isn't going to change anytime soon.
So as you suggest, if you were to actually graph this over a course of 200 and some years, there would be battles, there would be ceasefires, as you suggest, and so forth. Going back to George W. Bush for a second, that probably had the highest highs and the lowest lows of at least recent presidents, right? Because you had that, as you point out, that incredible high of rallying around him after 9/11 and that incredible low that he ended with.
Yeah, the range certainly was higher with Bush than any other recent president that I've studied and written about. But if you think about what's really the most critical environment, it does tend, if you're looking, say, at conventional media, the New York Times, Washington Post, the legacy media that sometimes people call it, the television networks, the coverage is pretty critical of Trump. And a lot of that has to do with the information, because one of the challenges that you have as a White House reporter is finding people who know enough to be useful as sources, but critical enough to tell you a story other than the, everything is awesome narrative that people who work for the White House are expected to convey. And one of the disadvantages for the Trump presidency in terms of its media management is the fact that there are so many disgruntled former employees in the Trump administration. And so when you look at the former Attorney General or the former Secretary of State or the former National Security Advisor #1 or #2 or #3 or the former Homeland Security Chief or #2 in Homeland Security, you have this whole narrative of people who are leaking like crazy talking about the Trump administration. You did not see that with the Obama team. You did not see that really with the Bush team either. And so I think that part of the reality of why the Trump coverage is so bad, so critical from the point of view of the Trump White House, has to do with the people that Trump has hired and what they're willing to say when they're leaving, or even sometimes, we suspect, while they're still in the White House, but telling journalists, not for attribution, what's going on that's critical of the president.
Right. Let's go back to the founding fathers, Dr. Chervinsky, and this whole notion of the endless battle. I mean, was it pretty much constant for the founding fathers that they had to face these press criticisms, or like in more recent times, were there highs and lows in terms of battles and ceasefires?
Well, I think there was certainly highs and lows, but it didn't necessarily come based on events. So one of the things that's really important to remember about the early decades of the United States was that there were different presses depending on what party you were in. So if you were a Democratic Republican or a Jeffersonian Republican or just a Republican, depending on what you decide to call yourself, you had a press that you tended to read and support. And if you were a Federalist or a Whig or you name it, you had a different press that you tended to support. And so if the press that was aligned with your party, that tended to be very positive and uniformly positive. So for example, Jackson had a newspaper that was the Jackson newspaper, and he worked with the editor to constantly churn out positive news stories about his administration. And in fact, the editor of the newspaper, Blair, who now the former resident of now Blair House, was one of Jackson's closest advisors. And so they were constantly working back and forth on what the story should be. So obviously they had a very positive relationship. Similarly, Jefferson and Madison worked to form newspapers that would be the Democratic Republican newspapers. They were obviously going to be very positive about Jefferson's presidency. On the other hand, however, the newspapers that were formed by the opponents were going to be pretty much uniformly negative. So it really depended on what newspaper you were looking at, what editor you were talking about, and what party you were from, because there wasn't that sense of journalistic ethos. That really developed later, the concept that journalism was a profession that was supposed to seek out the truth and speak truth to power. That was something that developed later, and instead journalism was very much a partisan activity.
So I'm hearing in what you're saying that back in the Founding Fathers era, because these papers were so closely aligned with parties, that everybody could pretty much read a paper and that would be their own personal echo chamber, because, you know, sticking with the tribe, so to speak. Would it be too much of a stretch to say that we're coming full circle on that now, and people who are pretty conservative are going to watch Fox News, and those who are pretty liberal are going to watch MSNBC or maybe CNN? I mean, they're not party organs, but are we coming back to that silo thing that Dr. Farnswoth mentioned?
I do think we're starting to get close. I mean, I think there are a couple of key differences. And the first you mentioned is that these, the newspapers and the media industries are not run by the party. So that was a pretty distinct difference. The second thing I would say is that people who lived in the 1790s and the early 1800s, the 1810s, they understood that newspapers were explicitly partisan. So they knew that the news they were reading, even if they agreed with it, was very much printed with this partisan agenda in mind. I think the problem we're facing today is that certain news outlets in particular are increasingly partisan focused, and sometimes even, you know, like if you go on Facebook and you read things on Facebook, there is no fact-checking mechanism. The problem is that people are still operating under this as though we were working in the same journalistic conditions that we were in the 1960s, where if you read something in the New York Times, you had a pretty high degree of confidence that it had been fact-checked and was reliable. Now, not 100%, of course, everyone gets things wrong, but you could be reasonably certain that what you were reading was true. That's not the case anymore, of course, with a lot of different outlets, but people haven't necessarily wrapped their mind around that. So we are not operating under the same sort of media literacy that people in the early Republic were doing.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question first and then shift it to Dr. Farnsworth, because you're talking about the ethos that came up in the 20th century in particular, got away from the party organ model. And it was actually the reason I got into journalism, and perhaps the reason you got into journalism too, Dr. Farnsworth. It was the call of journalism being a form of truth-seeking. It was journalism as a way to serve the public by digging into the facts in a way that they had the facts they need to have impartially delivered to make judgments on the governance of the country and on other important matters. So all this ends up being in a very simple question, which is, whatever happened to Walter Cronkite? I mean, Walter Cronkite was the guy who was winning all these opinion polls as the most trusted man in America. Be a little hard pressed to find a journalist these days that would be able to claim that title. Why are we so different from those days where the ethos was very much focused on facts and truth?
Well, I think the problem today is that there are a lot of people, if they don't like how facts sound, they think that that is criticism. And so then therefore, the person delivering it is partisan and is delivering partisan criticism. And sometimes facts are just facts. So for example, I like to share the statistic based purely on numbers that the Trump administration has had more turnover than any other cabinet. I'm not offering a judgment. I'm just saying based purely on numbers, that is the case. A lot of people would hear that and would think that I'm criticizing the administration, which I'm not doing. I'd be happy to offer that criticism, but in this moment, I am not offering any sort of critical judgment. And so I think the problem is that when you have people who react so strongly to facts as potential criticism, then journalists internalize that and media internalizes that because they want to be unbiased. They don't want to be accused of being partisan, rightfully so, because they want to uphold that journalistic ethos. They want to be the truth seekers. And if people are accusing them of being partisan, then that begins to sink in. And so then they start to think, well, maybe I need to present both sides or find a way to be a little bit more unbiased. And sometimes facts are just facts. And so I think that as a society, we need to be better about pushing back on that concept and saying, you know, it's okay sometimes to just report the truth, even if it hurts someone's feelings. If it's the truth, it's the truth.
Dr. Farnsworth, whatever happened to Walter Cronkite?
Well, CBS News dominated the environment of the 60s and the 70s in a way that no media outlet does today. You have, with the siloed news consumption that I talked about a moment ago, a real opportunity to go to news that is more about affirming your beliefs rather than informing you. And that is a very, very difficult environment for any news organization to operate within. Remember, there are two things that journalists have to do. You have to tell people what they want to know, because you're a for-profit business, and you have to tell news people they need to tell the public what the public needs to know. Now, there's not profit necessarily in telling people what they need to know. In fact, it can be really painful. I mean, if you talk about recruiting violations at a football team that's in Division I, that can make people mad. If you're going to talk about the president in a critical way, those supporters might not like it. What's different, I think, is less about how the media has changed, but more about the really increased coarseness of how politicians have changed. I think that, and this is not unique to Trump, I think this has been an evolution. I think if you look at the Nixon and Agnew years, there was an increasing criticism about the equivalent of what they would have called fake news. But in the end, the evidence was there. Watergate really did happen. It was a problem. There was obstruction of justice. Nixon was on tape, and he was on his way to San Clemente. That was a factual reality. What's different, though, now is that you have this environment where a president, President Trump, can go to Fox News, and he goes there regularly. He was on Fox News long before he was a candidate for president. He was on Fox News as a candidate for president, and he's on Fox News as president. When he tweets at things that have appeared on Fox News. And so there's a great symbiotic relationship, I think, from the point of view of the president's supporters, between the story that Trump tells and the story that Fox News tells. And that may not be the most objective way to become informed about the Trump presidency, but maybe citizens aren't really wanting that anymore. If you look at how politicians have and the political environment has become increasingly coarse, increasingly combative, I think there's a temptation on the part of at least some politicians to have a sense that maybe you can lie with less in the way of consequences than in the past. That you can go within friendly media, and people consuming that friendly media may not even hear about something you said that wasn't true. But that's also on us too, as citizens. I don't think that it's fair to blame the politicians. I tend to think they're responsive, just like media outlets are, to what the public wants. And if you look at the public reaction to this increasing coarseness over the last 30 years, you see it reflected not just in the politicians who are elected, but in public opinion in the country as well. You see, when you look at our primary system and the people who receive nominations, they're not getting rewarded for saying, I'm going to work across party lines. They're not rewarded for being centrists. They're not rewarded for anything along the lines of the way that a politician might have behaved when Republicans and Democrats got together to pass a civil rights bill in the 60s, or when Democrats and Republicans got together to tell Nixon that his time was up in the 70s. Those days are not with us. Part of that is the media, but I think it's at least as much a reflection of the politicians and the public as well.
Well, Dr. Farnswoth, talking about the politicians and also the public, shifting it back now directly to the press or the media. In your book, Nightly News Nightmare, and in some of your other writings, you've offered a pretty scathing critique of the job the media are doing in covering presidential politics. So I guess my question to you, starting with that critique, do you think things are getting worse or getting better in terms of the press and its coverage of presidential politics and presidents?
Well, I think there's certain narratives that we can point to that are consistently bad, and that really doesn't matter who the presidential candidates are. And when I say bad, I always talk about it in terms of the potential criticism. There's a very, very high level of criticism, and a case could be made that maybe the media are too critical in some cases. But I think what is more troubling to me than the level of criticism is really the level of triviality. I think that in many ways we see in the media, and this again goes back to coverage of the Reagan elections in the 80s, that there's a great focus on trivial things, on stories that can be simply told, on narratives that are comforting and that are that can be repeated. And so, for example, George Bush was probably smarter than the media narrative said that he was, because there was this idea that it's a very easy story to tell that Bush was kind of a dim bulb. I think that, that there is, with respect to Bill Clinton, the idea that he was sort of charming the country, that narrative. They went back to that narrative over and over again. And so I tend to think that the media, if you will, kind of dumb it down for us. And that's, I think, a significant problem, particularly with respect to questions of the horse race when you're talking about a presidential election. I think that one of the big, easy stories to tell is about the latest public opinion poll. We have polls every day, several times a day now in 2020 when we're looking at all these swing states, and we just see these surveys coming out all the time. And you have to frame a narrative. If you're a journalist, you're telling a story about a poll, and you have to find somebody to tell the story that makes sense, And so you go into a diner in central Pennsylvania or white working class communities in Ohio, and you tell the same basic story over and over again. We don't hear enough, in my view, during a presidential campaign about what these people actually do if they take office. I mean, I think that it is a significant shortcoming that we see in the media today, that there is so much focus on horse race. There is so much focus on what nasty thing one person said to the other. I mean, politics is treated as sports, but really what politics is our future. How are we going to educate our communities? How are we going to create an environment where our children have jobs? How are we going to provide for healthcare for people who get sick or people who are beyond their working years? What kind of programs are we going to have to deal with a world that is pretty unfriendly out there? And I think that a lot of these stories are not told. Let me give you an example, and this is an example from a while ago, so I don't want people to think that I'm really criticizing the media just today. In the 2000 election, Al Gore versus George W. Bush, there were on nightly news, the three ABC, NBC, CBS, those three networks, during the 2 months before the election, there were a total of 10 stories on foreign policy, just 10. The Cold War was over. We figured it was done. We don't need to talk about it anymore. We can just talk about the polling. The reality is that the presidency that follows, the George W. Bush presidency, was almost entirely a foreign policy presidency. We had the situation with 9/11. We had the situation with Afghanistan, Iraq, the growing difficulties in terms of dealing with a rising China, dealing with a revived Russia over and over again. However much they wanted to have an infrastructure week in the Bush presidency, they wanted to talk about trying to deal with the deficit in the Bush presidency. They could never deal with any of those things because the focus turned out to be entirely on foreign policy. But when we were evaluating those candidates in 2000, we had almost nothing to go on when it came to these foreign policy stories. And that is I think, a dramatic example of how television kind of misses the point. They don't do nearly enough coverage of issues, and we as a result aren't really all that well informed. Now, a counter to my argument would be, well, you can go on the internet and you could see position papers and policy discussions, and sure you can. But for a lot of people, they only have a few minutes to pay attention to politics. They're trying to keep home and hearth together. They're trying to have food in the fridge and keep the power on. And if you can't tell them in 20 or 30 minutes the most important things they need to know to be a good citizen, you're not doing them a service. If you say, well, we have it all online, you really haven't done the job that's important. But it is a challenge when you're talking about those two sometimes contrasting visions of journalism, telling people what they want to know so that you can keep the doors open, telling them what they need to know so that we can have a vibrant, healthy polity. It's a big challenge, and one that today's journalists are no better at solving than the journalists of a generation or two ago.
Dr. Chervinsky, since we're critiquing the press, maybe it'd be helpful if I asked you if you could take us back again to the Founding Fathers era. And basically my question would be, did the Founding Fathers have a clear view of the role the press should play in covering presidents, covering presidential politics? I mean, we know that there were party organs, but Jefferson, among others, had some very positive things to say about the nobility of the importance of newspapers. So what was the role back there in the Founding Father era what was the view of the Founding Fathers about what the role of the press should be in a healthy democracy?
Absolutely. Well, there was an understanding that freedom of the press was essential to democracy as a concept. And that was a tradition that they had inherited from Great Britain. And there had been moments in the past where the British Crown had clamped down on certain press abilities, and certainly press abilities to cover Parliament, and that had been really wildly unpopular. So there was this sense from the very beginning that the press was really essential to a healthy, vibrant democracy, and that it was essential to ensuring transparency. And so, for example, from the very beginning, when initially the Senate was not open to the public and its deliberations were not open to the public and was not open to the press, and a lot of people were very critical of that decision because they felt like, well, what are they trying to hide? And eventually the Senate did go the way of the House and, of course, opened up to the press and to observers. But this concept that the press was an essential estate in, if we think about, the American polity, there's the first, second, and third estates, and the press is the fourth estate. That was very much a concept and something that most people agreed upon. There just wasn't necessarily the same definition of journalism as a career per se. So it was more about the press as a general concept to ensure transparency and to ensure that there could be responsibility and politicians could be held responsible. So it was very important to people that, for example, legislation could be reported in the newspaper, that important treaties could be reported. So during Washington's administration, when the Jay Treaty was delivered, and initially Washington and Secretary of State Edmund Randolph decided to keep it a secret, that was reported in the news that it was secret, and that was very unpopular. And then they turned it over to the Senate, and the Senate deliberated, and the Senate decided to eventually release the treaty, and Washington was going to publish it, had selected the press that he wanted to publish it with and to include a letter of introduction. And the Republican newspaper scooped him and got the contents of the treaty from one of the Republicans in the Senate. And it was considered a big blow to the administration that they hadn't been the ones that published it, because it appeared that they were trying to hide the treaty. So the concept of the press as a mechanism with which to hold politicians accountable was really established from day one.
Well, let me ask you to take us inside the Washington administration for the nitty-gritty of this. Not just the theory, but it's hard for many of us to imagine the figure of George Washington, this marbleized figure we know on the dollar bill.
And you know who I mean?
Having,
Not the governor of Wisconsin.
negative publicity.
He's on the board of barely. Yeah, so we have.
Could you actually repeat that second part? I'm having just a little bit of trouble hearing you.
It's frozen.
Oh dear.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Could you just repeat the second part of that question?
Yeah, it's the nitty-gritty about what was it like inside Washington's administration when he reacted to some of this negative press coverage. It wasn't like the marbleized figure on the dollar bill we might have imagined.
Absolutely, that's so true. So initially when Washington came into office, his reputation was just spotless. And he was, if not the most famous man in the world, because some people think that I've argued with historian friends that maybe Benjamin Franklin was more famous, but I think Washington was the most famous man in the world at the time. And he was so well respected and adored and sort of treated as the father of the country that no one really dared criticize him. And he had worked long and hard for that reputation and had been very careful about cultivating it during the revolution and in the post-revolutionary years. So it was one of the real concerns about going into office is would he be able to maintain this this reputation, and would he tarnish it? And so for the first couple of years, he really escaped criticism. And then starting in 1793, especially, Hamilton had received some criticism for his financial legislation in 1791, 1792. And then the neutrality crisis broke out in 1793 when France declared war on Great Britain, and Washington and the administration decided to stay out of that conflict. And there was a lot of criticism that the United States was abandoning its allies and was not holding up its end of the bargain. And criticism only continued from that point on. And Washington hated it. He just hated it because he had such a thin skin and it really bothered him. And he felt like he was sacrificing his retirement years. He was away from home. He was working really hard, and people were not appreciating his sacrifice. They were not appreciating his hard work and what he was trying to do to bring the country together and get it situated and started on the right foot. And so there are amazing reports that Jefferson left us from his time in the cabinet where one of the secretaries in particular, it seems like Secretary Knox liked to kind of needle Washington from time to time, would bring up these reports and would bring up the scandalous, political cartoons. And Washington would lose his mind. He really lost his temper and he would yell about it. And in particular, there's this one example that I briefly mentioned earlier where first Philip Freneau and then Benjamin Franklin Bosch, they were both editors of Republican newspapers. And Washington had initially subscribed to them because he loved newspapers. And then once they got critical, he of course canceled his subscription. And both of them continued to deliver 3 copies of their newspaper every day to the president's house. And at one point in the cabinet meetings, Washington said, are they trying to insult me? And you can just tell he's so frustrated. And he was in fact so angry about it that he really wanted to mention it from time to time in his annual addresses to Congress or even in his farewell address. And his advisors kind of talked him out of that and said, that's really not a very good idea and will make you seem kind of petty. And they were right, because as soon as he retired, then people kind of went back to the universal acclaim and adoration.
Yeah, I'm still trying to get my arms around the image of George Washington losing it,
Well, it's such a more interesting image, and I think we've really done a disservice by making these founding fathers into these perfect marble-like creatures, because first of all, it's completely impractical and is never going to happen because humans are flawed and make a lot of mistakes. And so for us trying to study them as a way to learn about our nation and consider what we might want to do in the future, it's much more productive to remember that they were equally flawed humans that happened to do great things. But I also think that their flaws are so much more interesting and produce much juicier stories.
Absolutely, I'm all for that. Well, Lindy, we're actually getting close to running out of time before we're going to check in with Lindsay Crawford to see about the questions. But let me, Dr. Chervinsky, begin with you and then move to Dr. Farnswoth on this modern era question. And that is, we've talked about these partisan divides and polarization, founding fathers, different times during our history. But what about right now? And Leonard Downey, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, has a new book out. He's written a little bit about this. My question is this: has our political world become so polarized that we can't even agree on the facts? It's not just the opinions we have that we can't agree on what the facts are. And if that is where we are, how are we ever going to agree on the truth? Dr. Chervinsky?
I wish I had a really great answer to that. As a historian, my specialty tends not to be forward thinking. So I've been racking my brain trying to come up with a solution. And I think that unfortunately I think we can do a couple of things. We need to prioritize expertise and science and training, and history is a great way to do that, because every student of history has to study artifacts and has to study primary sources and understand what is a reliable primary source, what is a bias, what is the purpose of the person writing this. And that's a great way to analyze information and a very useful tool for anyone operating in the 21st century. I also think that we need to call on our politicians and on our leaders to embrace expertise, to embrace science, to embrace facts as a starting point, because so much of our political behavior starts with the modeling that is demonstrated by the people at the top, and it does trickle down, and it trickles down to the Senate and the House, and then to state leaders, and then to young people. There's a lot of studies that have shown that certain behavior has increased among students depending on what they see in the White House. And so at the very, very basic, element of public engagement, we should expect our leaders to embrace expertise and science and fact, and we should not accept anything less.
Thank you, that's very insightful. Dr. Farnsworth, what about you? Are we at the point where we can't really agree, well, these are the facts, so now let's exchange opinions about them. We can't agree on the facts.
Well, as I look at the contentious relationship between the media and the public, or the media and the presidency, I sort of feel like the tide goes in and the tide goes out. That you have these really contentious debates in the founding generation, and then, you move towards a period of time that isn't quite as nasty. And then it gets nasty again as the Civil War draws near. And then after that, there are efforts to try to work out differences that may not be optimal, but are better than fighting another Civil War. And so you see across the period of time of significant differences leading to greater accommodation. I think we're at a pretty high time in terms of the high watermark of polarization. Compared, say, to the 60s or the 70s, there was, a much greater ability, I think, of a critical mass of moderate Republicans and Democrats who could work together and push the country in a decision, particularly with respect to international matters and foreign policy, that was consistent largely across partisan lines. That Cold War mentality disappears, and in terms of domestic politics, the divisions are as great as they were in the 60s, and that's the 1960s. Maybe we're not quite to the 1860s, but it is important to recognize that these things come and go. I mean, ultimately, you cannot make a good decision as a citizen if you're not well informed, and the media is the key to that understanding. We are never going to watch, most of us, hours and hours of C-SPAN every day to get a sense of what's going on in Washington. And even then, by the way, if we were watching all that time on C-SPAN, as good as it, useful as it is, there are plenty of things that happen where the cameras aren't, that the reporters then tell us about. So there's a kind of monitoring function that is just so essential that the journalists do. Sometimes they do it well, sometimes they do it poorly, but it is essential that they do it as best they can. So I think that ultimately we are an impatient and a results-oriented people. And this is why maybe I'm a bit optimistic about the future, maybe more optimistic than some of the people in our audience tonight. And that's because we want what we don't have. I think that it is a reality of the American presidency in particular that we turn to what we don't have. If you think about Ronald Reagan, he was able to connect with the public and understand ordinary issues in a way that Jimmy Carter didn't necessarily seem that he could. And Jimmy Carter himself was seen as a more honest guy than the Nixon who was elected before him. And then as you go forward, maybe Ronald Reagan was a little detached from evidence and proceed close management. George H.W. Bush was the answer for that. But maybe he was too close to that. Then we have Bill Clinton, who once again understands America in a way that was more appealing in '92. But then, you know, there were moral issues involving Bill Clinton and his behavior. George W. Bush, he was seen as a more upright person. And then, of course, you know, with George W. Bush giving way to Barack Obama, seemed like maybe it was cool to elect an intellectual again. So there is this kind of dynamic, and I think that that one of the challenges that the next president post-Trump will be, whether this is president elected next month or 4 years from now, will be to answer that call for what we have that we want that we don't have at the moment. And it seems to me that one of the key issues gets back to what Dr. Chervinsky was saying a moment ago, that this issue of respect for science, respect for evidence. I mean, you know, you can be as confident as you want, but you know what? Diseases don't respond. They're not deterred by confidence. They're not deterred by your image of how tough you are. And that's something that demonstrates to us once again that impressions and media management and spin for a president are only going to get you so far. Then reality intrudes, and that reality is there whether you like it or not. And even when the public wants to imagine things are better than they are, the evidence comes back to haunt them and to provide new questions and new challenges for whoever comes next. Because remember, we put these people in power for a very short period of time, and then they have to answer to us. And if they haven't done well, it's time for someone else. And even if they have done well, we'll be done with them soon enough anyway.
Dr. Farnsworth, I have a question for you about a quote from one of your books. And recently rereading Presidential Communication and Character, you have a quote in there. And this deals specifically with the Trump administration. It's a quote from Trump's book before he became president, Art of the Deal. And I had been able to get it out of my mind since I read it again, because here's what Trump says in his book. I play to people's fantasies. I call it truthful hyperbole. Truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion. When I hear that and read that, I'm wondering, since he wrote it, is that a definition of Trump speak? And is that possibly the disconnect in some ways we see between the press and the president in this administration, is that he's speaking in truthful hyperbole as he sees it. The press is talking about facts and expertise and science, and never the twain shall meet.
Well, I think that's true, but I think even the term truthful hyperbole is a bit of a spin. And that's part of the narrative that the president employed. I mean, you really do have somebody who is very effective at media management in Donald Trump. He knows how to get media attention. He has dominated the news cycle across these last 4 years, and of course, the 2 years that he was a candidate before that, like nobody in our lifetimes. This is an extraordinarily effective person about bringing the focus to those areas where he wants that focus to be. That has been the story of his success in reality television and in reality politics, if you will. I think that is at the core of how he got to be president. The challenge, though, is that spin is less successful when you're not the head of a TV show. It's less successful when you're not the head of a family business. I mean, when Trump has all of his top executives around him, how many of them call him dad or father-in-law or sir? You know, that's a very different approach, say, than members of Congress have towards any president, where they see themselves as a co-equal branch. I mean, you know, if you were to look at, you know, the one thing that I would say is the most glaring challenge for the Trump administration is how they deal with bad news. There's nobody in the administration who is there to say, here's the story, it's not going so well. And you know, a successful president really needs naysayers around, not yes men and yes women. And I think that the Trump team has tossed aside those people who had more critical eyes about what the reality is out there. And the Trump presidency has suffered as a result. I think that that has to do with the idea that the president has, and it comes from a lifetime of being successful at spinning. He can spin his way out of this problem too. And you certainly see that in the last few days. You know, you might think that somebody who mocked wearing masks would feel a little bit chastened by actually having caught this disease, despite the extraordinary health protocols that surround a president. But what you have is Trump saying, you know what, maybe I'm invincible. You know, then I'm back at the White House just a couple of days later. And so that effort to spin away problems has its advantages in certain places. But when you're talking about government with divided power, and you're talking about government with critical media, you know, truthful hyperbole is exposed relatively quickly for what it is, not the full truth. And that's what the journalists do for us. People will like it, people may not like it, but the reality is that you have a much safer, more congenial environment when you're on the society pages of the New York tabloids than when you are trying to pass legislation with a Congress that does not listen to presidents much, no matter who is in charge.
And yet, even with this, is it fair to say, Dr. Farnsworth, that, I mean, when you look at the percentage of negative publicity about Trump, like in 2017, something like 93% of most media outlets were running negative stories. I mean, that seems awfully high for someone who was elected president of the United States, and presumably half the country doesn't necessarily agree with the assessments being reflected by the media. Do this really high negative percentages of negative news about this administration, can they be justified?
Well, you know, I can't justify every story that every journalist writes, but it is important to remember that Trump is the first president I can think of going back decades who has never cracked 50% approval across his presidency. It's important to remember that Trump's strategy as a politician is to talk to the base. I mean, you know, if Trump wanted to be reelected and was really sort of focused on that, you might imagine a very different course of action, reaching out to those voters who might not have liked him in ways that could be appealing. A big, generous COVID relief bill was an example of something he did that could have gotten him significant support. The idea of investing significantly in infrastructure. I mean, it's a joke sort of in Washington. You know, this week is infrastructure week every Monday, but reality intrudes. There are things that could have been done. You could have reached out, particularly if you look at what's called the autopsy report, the Republican Party's report after the defeat of Mitt Romney in 2012, that put forward a vision for how the Republican Party could succeed in an America that's getting increasingly diverse. Speak more effectively to young people, have more young people out there as voices. Speak effectively to small business concerns, those cross-pressured, maybe more libertarian Republicans who wouldn't necessarily be motivated by a Christian conservative social agenda. Speak to them. Connect with Latinos who are very concerned in many cases about small businesses and financially vulnerable folks. And so these are the sorts of scenarios that might get a President Trump above 45%. But that autopsy report, that GOP advice for the Republicans going forward, is something that Trump has dismissed almost in its entirety. And so that reality, I think, does create an environment where the coverage can be very critical. And that reality is where a lot of Americans are. I mean, if you look at the number of people in the streets in this country, and you have to go back to the 60s to see an environment like what we've been seeing these last several months. Even with COVID, people are taking these health risks to demonstrate. And those realities are part of the political environment. But also, I do think it's the coarseness of the time, too. I mean, when you think about the people who worked for Trump, who are very critical of him, when you think about the people in Congress who are willing to say more and more critical things of the president, the reporters are writing this stuff. And so, you know, if we don't like the media that we have, if we don't like the president we have, well, look in the mirror, because it's us who made this.
One thing I just want to mention that I don't know that we've necessarily addressed, but I think is really important for Dr. Farnsworth's point about spinning and Trump's position is that, as he said, you know, Trump has been appealing to his base. But from the very beginning, Trump has positioned himself as an outsider and as a running against the establishment. And that worked pretty well when he actually was an outsider and was not in Washington, D.C. And yet that policy and his approach to media and to politics has not changed. It's just that he is now the incumbent. And the American people, I think, and perhaps the press, are a little bit less likely to buy that spin and to buy that criticism when he's the one holding the bag. And so I do think that is an important distinction. One of the reasons that that approval rating hasn't ever bumped up, and perhaps the spin isn't working quite as well now as it did 4 or 6 years ago.
Right. Well, let me pause here and ask Lindsay Crawford from the James Monroe Museum. Do we have questions from our listeners, Lindsay?
Hi, I'm glad to be back. Sorry about the technical difficulty that we had there, but we powered through. We do have a few questions actually for you all today. I'm going to start with Mr. Carmen's question. Dr. Chervinsky, what do you make of James Monroe's cabinet? As good as Washington's? Not so much. Enjoying the book very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's always nice to hear when you've worked on something for a long time that people are enjoying it. James Monroe actually had a really fantastic cabinet. It was not only incredibly talented, but he did a pretty good job at managing what, was kind of like a team of rivals situation. I will say most presidents until Lincoln did have sort of a team of rivals because they tended to pull from their party opponents and from other leaders in the political ranks to staff their cabinet, and Monroe was no different. John Quincy Adams, of course, and Calhoun, they were both in the cabinet and had very strong opinions and expected to be listened to and often didn't agree with each other. But Monroe did a pretty good job at managing that, and his cabinet didn't ever undermine his administration, which I think is a really essential part of evaluating cabinet efficiency. And he had relatively little turnover and scandal as well, which is another key part at looking at how well a cabinet actually functions.
Until they started running against each other.
True, yes, of course. But that wasn't really his fault. But yes, until they started getting into politics, then it was a bit of a problem.
Another question for Mr. Carmen. Are our polarized media outlets similar to the early republic and even the 19th century where newspapers were often openly and proudly partisan? Is our belief that news should be objective actually a newer development?
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit in our conversation, but the concept that news journalists and newspapers should be objective is a late 19th early 20th century development when we think of the muckraking era and the progressive era, when we start to see reforms that are generated by newspaper reports that kind of alert people to what is going on. That's when we really start to think of this class of professional journalists. And so, as I said, in some ways, our news environment today is not all that dissimilar from the 1790s. The difference is we just don't always know it.
And going off of that, while we're on the topic, did the foreign press have a significant presence and or influence in the politics of the early republic?
The foreign press didn't have such a huge influence. I mean, the newspapers in the United States borrowed a lot from each other and borrowed a lot from newspapers abroad because they were needing to constantly fill the material and they didn't always have the same sort of constant churn of news that we did. So they would sometimes get newspapers from London and reprint some of those stories, but they didn't necessarily shape politics. That being said, foreign actors, foreign ministers certainly tried to influence politics, and they often did so in both covert and much more overt ways, both behind the scenes and then also trying to negotiate treaties. So that was there from day one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
For Dr. Farnsworth, did most media outlets cover Donald Trump less critically than other candidates because he was not taken seriously initially?
I think the thing to appreciate about Donald Trump when he first ran for office is that his prospects were not seen as all that great. He was at 3% in the polls and well behind Jeb Bush. But that exclamation point for Jeb turned out to be kind of a misnomer. The reality is that Trump had a mastery of the media, and apparently that is the key skill that you need in this modern media-dominated environment to get attention and to distinguish yourself from the field. I mean, even within the nomination struggle of 2016, Donald Trump made good copy. And so even though the poll numbers suggested he shouldn't be getting much attention because he's so far back, he simply got a lot of attention because he said things that were newsworthy. I mean, you know, from the very first, when he goes down the escalator in that made-for-TV moment, that's maybe something that some people might think of as parody, but it was the real deal for Donald Trump in terms of the way that he wanted to present himself as this affluent, successful businessman who could bring sense to the swamp that is Washington. That's the narrative that he told. And from the start, he decided that the most combative and aggressive approach to governing would be the most successful way to get noticed. You recall in his very first speech, he talked about Mexicans being rapists, and he said maybe some of them are good people, but the Mexicans are rapists, and they're sending they're not sending their best. Was the narrative that really focused this issue on immigration. And as these things draw more media attention to Trump, well, you know, as anyone with a little kid knows, rewarded behavior is repeated behavior. And that's true for politicians as well. If they get media attention, they are going to get more media attention by doing the same sorts of things. And Donald Trump delighted in sort of breaking the glass of being kind of iconoclastic. And that strategy was perfect for him because it really was a way to channel the anger. Because in many ways, there was an anti-establishment mood present in the country. This is part of the reason why Jeb Bush wasn't more successful. It's part of the reason why Hillary Clinton wasn't successful in the general election. And what Donald Trump understood was that there was no champion in that field of the true angry, anxious, frustrated working class whites who look around at the world that their fathers knew in the 50s in Akron or Buffalo or Youngstown and say, what is going on in this country? And what Trump could do very effectively is channel that. I mean, in a way, it seems kind of odd that a man of such gilded lifestyles and extravagant tastes, moving from one privately owned golf course to the next, could be the tribune of white working class resentment. But he did, truthful hyperbole, I suppose, make the case that he was the person who understood them best. And Americans, 40% of them, 45% of them, 48% of them, depending on whether we're talking about polling numbers or elections, they basically still buy that argument. And in many ways, I think that that reality is part of the issue of the focus on triviality that I've written about and expressed frustration about in terms of media coverage. Donald Trump was a good story because he said really, really outrageous things. Donald Trump, the coverage of Donald Trump going into the election had very little to say about policy. And if you listen to Donald Trump's debates in 2016, he had very little to say about policy. And I think that
Still doesn't.
And yeah, and it's still the case, right? I mean, you know, he just wants to win. He doesn't necessarily care that much how that policy gets there. And that creates an environment, I think, for us to look at the media and say they could have done more with respect to issues. We really needed more of what we were getting with Donald Trump. He was just a not Hillary Clinton vote for a lot of people. He was a not establishment vote for a lot of people. He wasn't a vote for particular policies. And I don't know that he still is, other
I
than
think
maybe.
it's striking that another New Yorker several generations ago from a wealthy family who would seem to have no real ties to the common people managed to become their tribune from a very different perspective in Franklin Roosevelt. Someone else, I think, who understood how to manipulate the media of his day in a very effective way. Now, I don't know if I could get very far doing a lot of comparisons of President Trump and President Roosevelt, but I think we are talking about, in part, as much how the political figures use and manipulate the media as the ways in which it manipulates them.
Well,
And,
I do want to weigh in, Scott, on FDR versus Trump. I think there's something very important to remember about Donald Trump, and an issue that he does not do well in is areas of empathy. I think that he channels anger very effectively. I don't think that he understands pain and suffering all that well. And when you look at FDR, you really see a much more empathetic figure. I think that, you know, maybe the FDR who ran for vice president before he was stricken with polio might have been a less empathetic individual. But when you have to spend your day being assisted, getting in and out of the bathroom and in and out of the car and in and out of the wheelchair, when you have to figure out ways to use dumbwaiters to get yourself up and down at Hyde Park, when you have those kinds of very humbling experiences in your daily life, and you have to go to such trouble to hide it from the American public because if they really saw your braces, they might think that a nation that needs to get back on its feet needs to hire a president who can walk. Why, if you added up all of that, you have a very different vision of that understanding of the challenges. I think that that one of the reasons that FDR is routinely recognized as among the top 3 or 4 American presidents was less about policy and more about empathy. I think that if you look at the New Deal legislation, you know, some things worked, some things didn't, but ultimately you had a sense in the country that here was a man who understood the trouble of people out on the road, people who might lose their homes, people who didn't have food in the fridge for their children. They had maybe not even electricity in their communities, and that he understood. And he connected in a way that is really, really extraordinary, not as a tribune for anger, but as somebody who understood pain. And that's a very different kind of connection with the public.
And if I might just jump off on that, when we're talking about the ways in which presidents can use media and different forms of communication to reach out to the American people, FDR's fireside chats were just a mastery at that. And sometimes he didn't even really necessarily have that much concrete to say. It was more of just, I hear your pain. I know what you're going through. Here are the things we're trying, or, you know, these things didn't work. We're going to try something else that's new. And it was a way to keep the American people updated, to assure them that the government was trying something, even if it wasn't necessarily going to work. And again, as Dr. Farnswoth said, it expressed that empathy. And so I think that, some presidents have used technology really well to express those things in moments of crisis. And, when we look at the current crisis we're in, this is obviously a relatively unprecedented global pandemic in which hundreds of thousands of people have lost family members or friends or colleagues. And Twitter could be a real source of comfort and information if the president wanted to use it in that way, and he's not.
Okay, I have a question from Scott Walker. In James Monroe's day, the citizen had only been a few miles beyond home. Today, we have access to the whole world. Does that make a difference with the current climate that we're in?
That is an intriguing question. Dr. Farnsworth, do you want to start? I can
Okay,
jump in if you
I'll do that.
I want to.
I think it makes a huge difference. We are much more able to learn about each other than ever before. I think that, if you think about oh, I don't know, the people fighting in the Civil War who'd never been 10 miles from the farm until they were put on a train and sent to Virginia. You know, the reality for so many people in so much of American history has been that the world that you knew was so small. But now, you know, as I teach at university, you know, I see this over and over again. And it was part of my own experience when I was 18, leaving a small farming town to go to college. You see the world in a whole different light when you have a range of opinions and a range of people from different backgrounds. The French have a wonderful saying that to understand all is to forgive all. And I do think that there's an element of that ability to connect when people are having a range of experiences. I think that's not true for everybody, of course. For people who stay in their hometowns and hang out with the people that they grew up with, they may not have the same range of experience. But even then, you think about the media and the world is connected and the experiences that people have. I mean, you can see all around the world what's going on in these different places and the struggles that people have. And you can be moved by their challenges or hostile to their experiences or anxious or threatened. I mean, that part of it is up to you. But we certainly know far more about the world. And that, I think, changes the way that we think about things.
I'll take a slightly different approach to answering that question, which is that I think that it has certainly made the job of the presidency a more difficult one, because Americans can no longer hide behind the distance of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. And if anything, 2020 has shown us just how connected an international community we actually operate in, and how things that happen in Wuhan can affect what happens in Los Angeles. And so I think that I think the interconnectedness of our world certainly makes things a little bit more complicated. I think the concept that the president is supposed to represent all Americans, he or hopefully eventually she, is the only official that is voted for by every citizen. That gets harder the more people that live in this country, the more diverse experiences that make up the American community, whether it be religion or race or education or background or sexual orientation. There are countless walks of life that the American president is supposed to represent. And that is a huge challenge, and one that not everyone is up to, and one that I think we can expect. We have to push presidents to represent all of those walks of life and not just the ones that vote for them.
And going back for just a moment to the earlier comparison between FDR and Trump, which would be a great thing to discuss on another occasion. But it's interesting the role of the media when you look at that comparison, because with the fireside chats and now with the tweets, you know, those are ways of getting around the established press to have direct communication with people you're trying to, either through empathy or by managing anger, connect with. But one other difference is Trump uses the media, the press, as a way to increase his support, as a foil, as an enemy. And that gives even more energy to his ability to channel the anger of the people who form, in some ways, who form his base. So it's interesting, though, that there are some similarities, but also dissimilarities between the role the press plays and the way these two leaders try to appeal, in some cases, to some of the same people.
I'd like to make an observation too, and this is something the audience wouldn't have known, but they might guess at. As we discussed putting this program together, we realized that we're sort of bookending American history from the very beginning to more contemporary times, and yet we've managed to indicate and hint at so much more we could talk about if we had more time. That so much of the relationship of politics and the media and presidential elections and media that fills the in-between of what we're talking about is fascinating too. And some of these things do keep coming up. Nativism, foreign influence, racism, economic imbalances, they all keep sort of cyclically making their way in to one degree or another in the conversation. I think we could probably plan to do some more phases of this kind of discussion down the road and fill in some of the blanks in between these sort of starting and current eras that we're talking about, because I think we could see, and with what Dr. Farnsworth said, to know everything, I think we can demonstrate perhaps in really looking across these elections and these periods that in some ways, even right now, we're not really talking about that many new elements. We're simply talking about the way in which they're combined and presented. But we have had these themes, and we seem to get down to the trough and then try to struggle out of it to a certain degree in cycles. I think in a way that shows there's a continuity in our political process from the beginning right up to now.
That concludes the questions that we have from the public right now. I don't know, we have a little bit more time. Mr. Jones, if you wanted to ask maybe one more concluding question.
Well, I guess my question would be to ask our two panelists. We've covered a lot of material in our time together. Was there one aspect of this topic that you were eager to address that we haven't touched on?
Well, one thing I might talk about is the extent to which the modern media environment does give presidents the opportunity to go around conventional media. I think that when you think about the sound bites that you see in terms of the quotation in a news story or online, the clip that is shown on a TV news report, presidents have to figure out a way to say something in basically 10 seconds. And 10 seconds goes by in the blink of an eye. Mark, read my lips, no new taxes. Mark, that's about 8 seconds. Okay, that reality means that you have to really dumb it down to get your message through in terms of the way that the norms of journalism operate in these current environments. And that's why it's so important. And I want to give you a great example of how this can be done, because Trump, I think, is a master of Twitter, but I think that Barack Obama was very, very effective in social media. And if you haven't seen it, I would encourage people who are listening in to look at Zach Galifianakis Between Two Ferns, the interview with President Barack Obama. At the time, he was trying to get people to enroll in the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And he was not really breaking through the traditional media. They weren't writing about things other than the problems of Obamacare, because the media, of course, are more critical than not. That's what we pay them for. That's why we pay attention to them. But he wanted to figure out a way to build up enrollment. So he went on this talk show, and after talking to Zach Galifianakis about his B-level movie career, he said, I'm actually here to pitch this idea about people enrolling in the Affordable Care Act. The deadline is coming up. Here's a chance to get insurance. And particularly for young adults, people in their 20s who might not have insurance, it was a master stroke. This was a way to connect with those people. And through social media and peer-to-peer file sharing and all the rest, a lot of people saw this. And you really saw an increase in the enrollment in the Affordable Care Act among those under 30s who were the key target of this appeal in the wake of that presentation. And similarly, with going back further to George W. Bush, he was able to use Fox News very effectively. And so you really see that how, and this is, I don't know that it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, but I will say it is a real thing. Presidents need to figure out a media that's their own and master it, or else they're not going to make it to the White House, and they're not going to do well once they're there. And so, whether it's the fireside chats or the extraordinary poetry of the Gettysburg Address, or the nasty partisan attacks of the founding generation, they have to figure out what they're dealing with and a way to turn it to their advantage. And it is an extraordinary story of success, really, when you think about presidential media management as a whole over these 200 years.
I would build off of that, and I would say the one thing that I think we maybe haven't touched on is how we sort of have hinted at it, and Dr. Farnsworth definitely did a great job of sort of leading into that with this interview that President Obama did. But there are so many new forms of technology and so many new forms of news. I will say this lovingly. Sometimes when I go home to visit my parents before the pandemic, they would say, oh, do you want to watch the nightly news? And I would sit there and I would watch it with them. And I would say, I got all of these stories online this morning. This news is at least 12 hours old. And if they're reading the New York Times, sometimes my mom will send me an article and be like, oh, did you see this? They'd be like, yes, it went around on my Twitter feed yesterday. And I think that is a really interesting reflection of how technology and the internet and social media is changing our news consumption, but then also the innovation of completely separate news entities. So there is a new news program called the 19th, I think, that's all about women's news. Of course, Crooked Media is a great example with the Pod Save America enterprise. These were all former Obama White House staffers in terms of communication and diplomacy, and they've created this enormous enterprise to basically try and counter Fox News. Each one of their episodes gets 3 million listeners, which is an insane audience for their news. And so I think that going forward, presidents will have to think carefully about how to make the most of those channels and those avenues. And even just in this campaign, we've seen the Biden campaign has put a ton of money into ads on the front page of YouTube. And I can guarantee that that was not a major source of spending in past campaigns. And yet that's a really effective way to reach people. And so I think there will be a generational shift going forward, but also a technology one. And while, you know, I do think there's sometimes a tendency to be like, oh, these new kids and their, you know, technology, it's an opportunity. And I think it should be one that people aren't afraid of.
And going off that, we actually had one more question from the public that came in while you were speaking on this. It's from Daniel Z. It says, good evening. How impactful do you believe this president has been in legitimizing alternate social media platforms such as Parler?
Well, I can't speak to that particular social media platform because I don't actually use that one. But I do think that for better or for worse, Trump has made Twitter even more of a thing than it was before. And traditional news media sources cover his crazy Twitter rants. Like this morning, I think he tweeted like 70 times in an hour. And traditional media sources cover that. And so social media has become a central part of our political fabric. And whether it is Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp or TikTok, you know, you name it, whatever the platform is going forward, I think it will continue to play a central role because it is the best way to reach new voters.
Thank you.
I think at the risk of sounding too avuncular, what you just described though with your parents, it is for their generation before, going back to radio, sitting around the radio, listening to Roosevelt, watching Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley. That was the original social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that what we ironically call social media, while it's a much larger virtual audience, it's actually individualized our consumption in a way that's kind of striking. You don't necessarily have the same interplay between people watching the same thing at the same time. The human element of it to me has been lost a little bit, but now I'm starting to sound really old and crouched.
Well, but there are, so just to, you know, to push back on that a little bit, there's a great community online called Historians at the Movies, #HATM. And what it basically has done is taken advantage of the Netflix era, and every Sunday night it selects a movie and people press play at the same time. And then historians and everyone else who's watching it can join in on Twitter with this hashtag and talk about it, talk about the historical or political themes and what it tells us about society at the time and society today. And it is a way to create that community-based watching experience.
Scott, before we close, I just want to note that over the last 90 minutes, it's mind-boggling how many different issues we've touched on in a 231-year span of American history. So I would like to personally thank the two doctors in the House, Chervinsky and Farnswoth, for all of your contributions tonight in a lively and rich conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed, thank you. And thanks to our moderator, once again, guiding us through a successful program. Lindsay, you've done a great job on the board. We do want to remind folks that this program will be archived on Facebook and on our YouTube channel, the James Monroe YouTube channel, James Monroe Museum YouTube channel. So be looking for that. And please, as we said, if you're out and about, come out to the museums in person, and also look for more online programming from all of our university museums. So for the James Monroe Museum and the University of Mary Washington, thanks for watching.